I'm Debbie Riono. I'm the president of the Moorpark Historical Society, 2004, and have been for a couple of years. Probably will be for another year or two. We tend to have a very small board, then people keep repeating their offices. But it's a great little organization, and what we really want to do is to let people know that there was a Moorpark before the 80s when most of the people started coming here. That's when the Simi Valley Freeway was completed so that it was really easy to get to Moorpark, and the city began to grow then. And we went from about 5,000 in the year 1980 to about 35,000 now in 2000. So there was a huge growth spurt there. And we want people to know there was a town before that and what happened. And some of the people who have been talking, we had Charlie Schwabauer. He and his wife Mary, I've known for years. Mary's family is the Levins family. They have a lot of property in Ventura County, a lot of citrus farming that they do. And they live up north of town. They have a ranch. And they've been involved with historical things for years. In fact, they started the Historical Society.
Charlie did.
Charlie and Mary. And Mary now is on the Ventura County Historical Board. So they're very involved in everything. James Whitaker, his family has the oldest business in town, maybe even the oldest business in this part of Ventura County. It's Whitaker Hardware, still on High Street. It was started in the 1920s by his grandfather and his father. His two sons run it now. Bart Miller, he came in 1950, and he and his wife Vernis were very active in town. In fact, Miller Parkway, which is off of Tierra Hada Road, was named after them in their honor. Vernis passed away about a year or so ago. Bart was the postmaster here in town. He and Vernis started the Little League. They started all sorts of things and were just really involved with the community. Irene Cameron, she was a reporter along with Vernis at the newspaper in town for years and years. And Irene is just as sweet as can be. She's in her 90s now, but she's been involved with the Moorpark Women's Fortnightly Club and other organizations all over the community. And Andy Waters, he's a rancher also north of town, and his family's been here for, again, when he was a baby is when they came out here, and he had relatives out here before that. He was related to the Hitches off of Hitch Boulevard. And Andy made reference to the Carpinteria game, which was a really big thing here in Moorpark. The last team that had beaten Carpinteria was in 1934. Andy was on the team back then. And then they went for 60 some odd games. They weren't consecutive years, but games without beating Carpinteria. It was the longest losing streak in the country. In fact, Sports Illustrated even made note of it. It was such a long losing streak in high school football. And it was in 98, I believe, that we finally beat Carpinteria. It was the last time we could possibly play them because we were moving up. We had grown and we were moving up into a different division. And we got into the playoffs against Carp. The game was at Moorpark High Stadium, and we must have had 4 inches of rain during that game. Everybody was there with tarps over them, and it was just a mud bath. But we finally won, and so that was actually a really big moment in Moorpark's history because we won. We beat Carpinteria, and that was something we've been trying to do for 60 years. So that was a lot of fun.
What was the 68 years that the one gentleman referenced to as far as sports?
That was the Carpinteria.
Not
He said the
big.
championship, but actually it was losing to Carpinteria for that many years in a row.
68 years.
Yeah. Like I said, that was a national losing streak for high school football.
Now, you said Irene worked for the newspaper. Which newspaper was that again?
That was the Moorpark Enterprise. It started out in 1910 or 11 as the Moorpark Star, then became the Moorpark Enterprise. Then when Simi Valley got bigger in the 1960s, it became the Simi Valley Enterprise. Then the Moorpark had the News Mirror, which the Enterprise bought. And then in the 1990s, they all became the Moorpark, or the Ventura County Star. So we had the Moorpark Star, the Simi Valley Star, and had all the Star newspapers again. So it kind of went full circle from starting out as the Moorpark Star to coming back to the Moorpark Star.
And that's what it's called now.
And that's what it's called now. We covered a lot of material regarding the Moorpark in the 50s and the 60s a little bit. We didn't really get into the 70s, but around 1970, there were really big plans for Moorpark. At that point in time, the general plan for Moorpark called for us to be a city of 100,000. So we would be as large as Thousand Oaks or Simi Valley. What happened though was that those towns grew, the freeways hadn't come through yet, and by the time we finally had the freeways here so that we could grow, people at that point weren't so enthralled with having a town of 100,000 anymore. And now, since then, of course, we have no growth ordinances to keep the population limited. So Moorpark now has about 35,000 people, which is a really good size. We need to grow because people keep having babies. We have bedrooms in our houses, and that leads to more people coming and people moving in here. So we do need more housing, but we're probably about where we'll be for a long time. We're not going to have the huge explosive growth that there were in the 80s and 90s.
Now, I sat in a couple planning commission meetings in that for the Moorpark area, and there looked like there were some huge developments trying to go into the city of Moorpark. Are they pretty adamant about not allowing them, especially the one off of Collins Road?
There are still some big housing projects that are being planned for Moorpark. One in particular, it used to be known as the Messenger property, and now it's being called North Park. It's about 1,300 homes, which actually isn't all that big. Mountain Meadows, which is the biggest development in town, is about 3,200 homes. So it's half of the number of houses, but it's on 2 or 3 times as much land. So the density is not going to be nearly as big. And there are pros and cons. Any big development now has to go to a vote of the people. And while getting people in really makes a community good in some respects, you're bringing in more people, more resources, so you can have better schools, more parks, and a lot of other things. On the other hand, you have more traffic and more congestion and more problems. So it's kind of a mix. You have to decide. You have to be able to grow. You can't stay stagnant, but you don't want to grow at such a rate that the town becomes so congested nobody wants to live here anymore. So I think overall Moorpark is pretty nice. We have the valleys surrounding us and separating us from Thousand Oaks and Simi Valley. So it's a very nice place to be. My daughters, they love it here. They like going into Los Angeles because it's the big city, but when they start talking about having families eventually, they want to come back out here to a nice small town, relatively small town, with great schools, great parks, and a nice place to live.
Along High Street, are they going to continue developing the older buildings and bringing them back to life, like the theater and that?
High Street is Moorpark's historical street, and it has been studied and studied and studied since the 1970s as to what's going to happen there. And I'm not sure what's going to go on. It's a beautiful little area, but the commercial area of the town has moved to Los Angeles Avenue because that's where there's the traffic flow, that's where you can build the big stores. So probably on High Street it would be nice to have professional buildings and antique shops and restaurants and make it a destination place. It's just getting to that point that's difficult to do.
What was on the land where that very, very large apartment complex is going in right off of LA Avenue?
Los Angeles and Moorpark Avenue, almost all of that along there used to be turkey and chicken farms, mostly turkey farms. It was all a little 2-lane road, and you could go by and see some of the turkeys and the barns and the cages. It was very rural and rustic for a long time. I moved here in the early 1979, and at that point, if you saw 3 cars at the only signal in town, you'd wonder where all the traffic came from. It was very, very different then. Now we have all of the trucks rumbling through, which of course they come through because there's a lot of demand for a truck from the port. We have the agriculture, and the option for the trucks is to take the Conejo grade up the 101, which truckers really don't like that because it's so steep. So we get a lot of truck traffic and a lot of other traffic now. The city's grown. But yeah, that used to all be turkeys.
Turkey farms.
And one little interesting story that kids always get a kick out of is where McDonald's is now. That used to be a chicken ranch. And the story is that one night in the barn that is where McDonald's is now, there were thousands and thousands of baby chicks. And an owl got in and started swooping back and forth through the barn, scaring all the little baby chicks. Farmer came out, shot the owl, but there were about 10,000 baby chicks that died because they were scared to death. So I tell the little school kids then, when you have your McNuggets at McDonald's, just think of all those little baby chicks that are floating there, the little ghosty chicks, and the kids always crack up. They think that's funny.
Now, did the city of Moorpark have any fun celebrities or historical in that term? Like Chatsworth had Lucille Ball, and So Much Land was owned by Bob Hope. Was that any of the case out here in the Moorpark area?
Moorpark has had a couple of celebrities. Probably the most famous is Walter Brennan. He had a ranch a little bit south of town off of what is now Sunset Meadow. I forget the name of the roads. Off of Old Moorpark Road. Walter Brennan and his wife lived there for years. Joel McCrae, who was an actor primarily in the 40s, he was a little bit further south of Moorpark, between Moorpark and Thousand Oaks, but he did a lot here in town and owned some property and was always shopping at the stores. So those are about the only two celebrities that we've had around here. Moorpark did have notoriety in the late 50s because we were the first community powered by atomic power. There was a little atomic reactor set up in the hills above Simi Valley, and they switched on the power here, and it didn't last for very long. In fact, another town claims that it was the first atomic powered town because theirs actually stayed on for quite a while. But here it was the very first time that atomic power had been used to light any place. And Edward R. Murrow, who was the big newscaster at that time, the big anchor, he came out here and did a segment from Moorpark. It didn't air for several days because they didn't really have live TV back then. Mm-hmm. But that was one of our places in the history book.
And how long was it actually on for?
I'm not sure. I heard anywhere from 10 minutes to a day or two. Not very long, but we did it.
Now, did you ever have your own radio station out here in Moorpark?
No.
No.
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
Going back to the first part of the century, Moorpark itself was founded by Robert Poindexter, who was a railroad agent. And he knew that the railroad was going to be coming through this area, and like all over Southern California or all over the country, when a railroad went through, it was a good place to build a town. So he knew the railroad was coming through here. He bought the property and mapped out the town of Moorpark. And he was really fond of Scotland. So instead of having a Main Street or an Elm Street like communities all over the rest of the country do, we ended up with High Street and Charles Street as our main ones because they were Scottish names, and he was really fond of Scotland. And then he also named the town after a type of apricot, Moorpark, because he thought it sounded so nice. So that's how we got our name of Moorpark.
Excellent.
And that was in the year 1900 when he founded the town. Shortly after that, they planted the pepper trees on High Street as a beautification. They also planted pine trees along Moorpark Avenue, but those have long since come down. Most of the pepper trees are still there, although they're getting pretty aged now, and some are coming down and being replaced because of disease. Then the town started developing a social life. So the Moorpark Women's Fortnightly Club was the first club that was founded, and that was in 1905. And what they did, the women would get together, and at that point, there were no street names other than right in the town itself. So if people needed directions to get someplace, they had no idea where to go. It was, go to the fifth field and turn left at the third post or something, very obscure directions. So the Fortnightly Club actually named most of the roads in the area, and then they bought signs to designate what the roads were so people would actually know where they were going. So that was one of the things the Fortnightly Club did. And then in 1911, there were no high schools here. If you wanted to go to high school, you had to go to Ventura or Oxnard and go to boarding school because it was too far to commute by horse back then. They didn't have cars yet. So the women spent $900, had all sorts of fundraisers, bake sales and whatnot, built a clubhouse over on Charles Street, which still stands. It's a private residence now. And they turned that into a high school. until a public high school could be built in 1920 or 21. And that was also the first library in town. So the Women's Fortnightly Club is still going strong. They have 100 members, and they did a lot for the town. It's been a terrific group. Another longtime organization, or not organization, but church function, was at the Moorpark Methodist Church. For the early years, if you weren't Methodist, you really didn't have any choice of churches here. There weren't any. It was Methodist or nothing. And the Methodist Church, which still exists today, for the second half of the 1900s, from about World War II until about the year 2000, had a community turkey dinner every Thanksgiving. So the Sunday before Thanksgiving, or the Saturday, they'd have the big turkey dinner, and everybody in the town would come out for this turkey dinner. It finally got to the point where it was just too much to manage, and not too many people were interested in helping out anymore, so it discontinued. But that was a great tradition here in town. Everybody loved going to that.
And when did that start?
That started around World War II.
World War II.
Either during the war or right afterward.
And it ended when? How long did it last?
It ended around 2000.
That's pretty good. That lasted a
99.
long time.
Yeah.
And the Boys and Girls Club, they still do a lot for children, don't they? Every year they do a big Christmas party.
The Boys and Girls Club got started in the 1980s. The Rotary Club, which is a group that's done a lot here in town, they had a summer camp program just to give kids something to do. And after 2 or 3 years of doing that, they affiliated with the Boys Club, which quickly after that became the Boys and Girls Club, and bought the gym at the old Moorpark High School and converted that into a club, and they still meet there. And they have several hundred members, and it's a terrific organization. Another good story about Rotary is in 1982, Moorpark High School was just starting to grow, but it was still a pretty tiny little high school. And we were getting a band started, and there was no money to buy band uniforms. There hadn't been a band at this high school in years. So the Rotary and some other groups in town decided that we're going to buy band uniforms for these kids. So they had all sorts of fundraisers in town. There were dances, there were lasagna dinners, just everything to raise money for band uniforms. They finally got enough. They ordered the uniforms, and the very first event was going to be the Country Days Parade. And the uniforms weren't done. So Bill McMahon, who's a member of Rotary and a lifetime resident of Moorpark, he ended up flying to Missouri to personally pick up all of the uniforms and fly them back here so that the kids could wear them for the parade. And I think they made it with like 1 day to spare. But they had their uniforms, and that was launching a modern school age for us.
That is wonderful. Now, what's the reason he had to fly there to get the uniforms and fly them back? They just couldn't send them out?
You know, I don't really remember.
That?
I think either he went there and kind of sat on them until they actually finished them up, or he didn't want to have them shipped UPS because he didn't know how long that might take, or whether they'd get lost.
Spur the production on and hand deliver.
Yeah.
That's excellent. Now, as far as the fire department, the police departments and that, they seem like they're pretty supportive. They're in town, and this is a growing concern about the safety because of Simi Valley being so close and Thousand Oaks. It seems like a little competition who's going to have the safest city in that.
Moorpark's never really had much of a crime rate. This has always been a pretty safe city. We contract with the Sheriff's Department for police services, and then fire services are also handled by the County Fire District. Moorpark's fire department was strictly a volunteer fire department for years and years, but it got started actually by I.G. Tanner in the building that's at the corner of Moorpark Avenue and High Street. That was I.G.'s garage, and he started the volunteer fire department in about 1920, and before that time, it was a bucket brigade. People would grab their milk buckets or whatever they had when they heard the church bell ringing really, really fast. If it was Sunday morning and the bell was ringing slowly, they knew they were being called to worship. But if it was any other time of week and the bell was ringing really quickly, they knew there was a fire. Everybody would grab their buckets and they'd form a bucket brigade, and that's how they fought fires. And there were quite a few fires in Moorpark. Just about every big building, it seems, when you go through the Moorpark story, burned down, so there were a lot of fires back then. And IG decided at one point then that he would get the equipment and store it so that there would be a real fireplace. And he bought the equipment, kept it in his garage. And then the gentleman earlier today were talking about how he would be there 24/7 every day of the year. So whenever there was a fire, he'd have the equipment and pick people up on his way to wherever the fire was.
Now you say equipment, was it a horse-drawn
It was
fire truck, or was it?
the very first equipment. I don't know what it was, but then they got a truck later on.
They got an actual motorized vehicle,
Yeah.
fire truck. And now, does his family still live in Moorpark?
Not that I'm aware of. One of the things the Historical Society does is a living history of Mabel Bradley. Mabel Bradley was the telephone operator in Moorpark for the early half of the 1900s, from 1914 until the 1940s. And at that time, everybody was connected by the operator. Moorpark didn't get dial telephones until the 1950s. So up until then, whenever anybody wanted to call someone, they had to call on the operator with the old crank phones, and the operator would make the connection. So Mabel Bradley makes a great person then, or a character for the living history, because she knew everything that was going on in town. If somebody couldn't find, it was dinner time and Ma was missing, they could call and say, "Do you know where she is? We're trying to track her down." Or, "My cow got lost, is it wandering around there someplace?" And Mabel could make some calls and figure out what was going on. So she's an ideal person to talk about the early history of Moorpark. And we have a great deal of fun with that character. She has a big floppy hat and a Titanic style outfit that she wears. And then we talk about how the streets were named and the businesses back then. I mentioned that there was the Women's Fortnightly Club. Well, the men weren't going to be outdone, so they had what they called a gentleman's resort, or a club for gentlemen. And actually it was the pool hall and barber shop, but it was a place for gentlemen to go to. They weren't going to be outdone.
The Gentlemen's Club.
That's right.
Is that still today?
No.
Do they still?
No.
They don't meet. Now, didn't Moorpark just do a Civil War reenactment?
The Rotary Club started doing Civil War reenactment just 3 years ago, so
Okay.
that's something pretty new.
Is there quite a bit of history of the Civil War here and
No.
individuals, or no? In
None.
Moorpark? Okay.
It's just a good fundraiser idea.
Okay. Now, you do the Mabel Bradley character, right?
I do the Mabel Bradley character, and I do it in front of schools or civic groups. And people are fascinated with the history. They like learning what was going on. One of the other stories that I tell is about the Spanish flu epidemic, which came after World War I, and a lot of people here in Moorpark died from that. In fact, around the world, it was one of those great pandemics where 20 million people died over the globe. But here in Moorpark at that time, there was no doctor, and people would have to call Mabel, and she would call the doctor in Oxnard and get instructions on how to treat the sick people. And that was how it was handled. The doctor would get here when he could, but in the meantime, the connection was the telephone and Mabel Bradley. And they had to close the schools and the church for a while because of the threat of the spread of the disease. So there have been some sad times here too. On High Street, a lot of the buildings there look very historical, and some of them really are, but some of them are brand new. There's one on the south side by the railroad track that looks like a big, huge railroad depot, and it actually is pretty much of a replica of what was the railroad depot. But what it actually is a facade that hides the granary for the old granary for the egg ranches that were here. When they built that there, it was right in the middle of downtown, and having all of these big steel canisters for grain didn't look very nice. So they built a facade there that made it look like an old depot. And people, when they go by that, they're always saying, "Oh, why don't you turn that into a restaurant? Or that would be such a good museum." But it's nothing. It's like a movie set.
It's just a facade.
It's just a facade. There's nothing there.
What's a great one?
And then there's another building there The Wardlow Building is what it's called now. And that building looks like an old two-story Western building. It's gorgeous. And that was actually built in 82 and 83 by the Schlevies. And it's a new building, but they used parts from old mansions that were being dismantled in Northern California. So it's a new building with all old parts, and it looks, even the glass, so it looks like it's very old and has been there forever, but it's one of our newer buildings in town.
It's a great structure. Now, is the theater, they still have performances. They still use, it's a very active theater, correct? On High Street.
The theater was built in the 1920s, and it was the only movie theater in all of Eastern Ventura County for a long time. In the 1980s, it became a melodrama theater for live theater, and it was that for 15 years probably. And it was very popular, but there were some ownership changes, and eventually it went out of business. And right now, it's been refurbished, and it's absolutely beautiful, but the current owner doesn't want it anymore, and he's trying to sell it. So what kind of future it has is up in the air. There's a group of people who are trying to preserve it, maybe get the city to buy it and keep it as a public entity of some sort or cultural spot. And there are other people who say its time has come and gone. It's beautiful, but it's pretty impractical. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there.
Now, would you like to, the Moorpark Historical Society, would they like to register that as a historical landmark and save it?
That's a thorny issue. We can suggest it be given historical designation, but in order for anything to actually happen, it has to be done by the property owner. We can just say, yes, it's a historical building, which doesn't carry a whole lot of weight other than it's the Historical Society saying it's a nice building.
Correct.
But for any kind of tax benefits or anything else, the owner has to go through that process.
And the fire station has been new? Is it brand new, or did they relocate it? It looks like a new structure where the fire station is.
The fire station on High Street is brand new. The fire station had been over at Moorpark Avenue across the street from City Hall since the 1950s, I believe it was built. And then they just moved to High Street in 2004, beginning of 2004. And it's a beautiful building made to look like it's very old. It has a pole that the firemen can slide down if they so desire. So it's a nice building. Again, it looks old, but it's brand new.
Yeah, it's a great structure. And where the Secret Garden is, what used to be in that particular structure? Was that always a restaurant?
The Secret Garden building has been a lot of things over the years. It started out as a grocery store, and it has been a car dealership. At one point it was split so that it was part video store when videos were brand new, and part flower shop, because a video store or a flower shop in Moorpark neither could be an entire building. It was just too much. And it's also been an ice cream parlor. It's been a lot of things over the years. It's a nice little building. The Metrolink train, that started in the 1990s, and that was a real godsend. It used to be that in the early part of the 1900s, people would come out from Los Angeles to picnic in Moorpark. They'd ride the train out here, have a picnic under the pepper trees, and then go back into town. And then, as years passed, of course, that died out, and people would commute into Los Angeles, which was a long drive from Moorpark. Now we have the Metrolink, which is great because that goes into downtown LA. Sometimes people come out on it, but virtually it's just for commuter use. So people take it into downtown LA in the morning and come back in the evening. But that's been really nice having that there. And then we have Amtrak, which also makes stops there, and you can take the Amtrak train up to Santa Barbara or Points North. So that's a really nice thing downtown now, too.
Yeah, downtown is very quaint. Now, the little barbecue place, has that always been there? Has that got a little history to it?
No.
Down there? No.
I don't know what the history is of that.
That's a cute little restaurant. And then you've got Maria's, and you have little Chewy's, and
yeah.
got all those little teeny tiny restaurants dotted along there.
Moorpark College is a great part of Moorpark. That was built in the 1960s, and Right now, it has EATM, which is the Exotic Animal Management Training Program. It's one of only 2 zoo training programs in the entire country. So there are people from all over the world who want to go there. There are actually about 300 animals up there at the zoo on the college lot. And it's a great place to go on weekends. They open it up so you can tour it. They give animal shows. But it's fun. And if you are over in that part of town, especially at dusk, you can hear the lions roaring, and I think they're gibbon monkeys whooping it up. It can be very exotic.
And do you know, I don't think hardly anybody knows about that, even that live here in Moorpark. That's phenomenal.
The zoo is something that a lot of people aren't aware of, but we're very proud of it. Also, Moorpark College has been very good in athletics. And the debate team, the forensics team, has won national championship, I believe 6 or 7 times. It has quite a reputation. Moorpark High School has won the national decathlon once. No, I take that back. Moorpark High School has won the national decathlon twice and gone to it additional times and been state champion. So we have a tremendous high school here. It's
Great academics. Now the zoo, who started that? That's interesting. How that wound up at the college out here?
How the zoo got started at Moorpark College was there were professors who were interested in it, and I'm not sure of the mechanics behind it, how they got permission to go ahead and build it, but they did. At one point, they were looking at making a much larger zoo that would be open to the public on Old Los Angeles Avenue. We've had other plans besides the big zoo for Moorpark that haven't come to fruition, but could have been very interesting if they would have. At one time in the 80s, there was a plan to turn the Tierra Rajada Valley between the 23 freeway and Simi Valley into a giant lake and have camping around it. It was a terrific plan. Wow. Right now, the Reagan Library overlooks that site, but it was flooding every winter. It would flood until they got some drainage in there finally. So it just seemed a logical place to build a lake and have a campground, but that didn't go anywhere. We were going to have a huge facility in Happy Camp Canyon that would be golfing, a huge conference convention center, a shooting range, all sorts of plans, and that's pretty much just open space now with lots of trails. They put a golf course on the very lower part of it. But there had been some pretty dramatic plans for that. We also, at one point in the 70s, Hewlett-Packard was looking at building a huge plant in the Tierra Rajada Valley just west of the 23 freeway. And that also didn't come to fruition. If it had, Moorpark could look a lot different now than it does with that farmland still there.
Very much so. Now, along Tierra Rajada, isn't that considered greenbelt? Or that there was someone was designated and off the 23 or something like that?
Moorpark is surrounded by greenbelt, and that is because as people realized what was going on in Los Angeles and Orange County particular, because that was more recent growth, that cities were just growing into one another. So in Ventura County, they set up the greenbelt system, and there's an agreement between Simi Valley, Thousand Oaks, and Moorpark that the strips of land between the 3 cities would be kept open space. So that includes pretty much the entire Tierra Rajada Valley, that it will be kept open, very limited development. You can have some items there, 1 house per 40 acres or something that's related to agriculture, but they don't want it built up. They want it to stay open space so that you don't have one city just bleeding into another city.
I think you covered quite a bit.
Do you know anything about the feathers and flies?
Feathers
That we heard about?
The chickens and the flies.
The flies were so bad they covered that building. Remember that one gentleman said that? They were so bad
That's
they
what I'm
covered the whole
curious
side
about.
of the building.
When I came to Moorpark, the chicken farms were still in existence. The biggest one, Egg City, had been the world's largest egg ranch. It was huge. And then in the early 70s, it got hit by Newcastle's disease. So they had to kill, I think it was 15 million chickens. I mean, they had a lot of chickens out there. And you not only had a lot of flies, but the stench was really bad. Poor Fillmore got most of it, but every once in a while you could smell it here in Moorpark too. And my understanding is that the fly situation was really bad. And Joe Latunsky, who was one of the town characters, he just hated the flies, and he was determined to have something done about it. So he had a car that had a giant fly on top of it, and my understanding is that he collected all sorts of dead flies, just bushel baskets of dead flies, and took them up to Sacramento as a protest to the state legislature to force them to do something. And eventually they formed what was called the Mosquito Abatement District, which was actually a fly abatement district. And they got rid of the flies. And of course, the poultry farms became economically unfeasible anymore, especially the ones that had been downtown Moorpark. And so they just went out of business, and that eliminated a lot of the problem too. If you didn't have the birds anymore, you didn't have the flies. What I thought was interesting was Andy talking about the camping that the apricot workers would
300
do.
on his
Yeah.
property, he said at one time.
The agriculture in Moorpark has really changed over the years. Originally, because there wasn't much rain here, and what did come was just in the winter, there were mostly things like beans that were grown throughout all of Ventura County, actually. Lima beans were a really big product because they didn't require a lot of water. Everything was dry farming that didn't take a lot of water. And Moorpark was fortunate because we were one of the few spots in this area that actually had groundwater. Simi Valley and Thousand Oaks didn't have groundwater. We did. In fact, we still get a lot of our water from wells. We don't need to import as much from the state water project. But before we could really get going with other types of agriculture, we had to go hook up to the state water project to bring in the water to irrigate. And then that became the citrus and avocados. And now around town, especially to the west, raspberries are becoming a hugely popular crop. Strawberries and the rest of Ventura County are really big. We don't have too many strawberries around here, but the raspberry crops are really starting to come on their own.
I was talking to George Tish, and he said that the Somas area and that is known for lemons.
That'd be Moorpark 2 and Somas,
Well,
yeah.
okay. Which I was quite surprised to find out about lemons. And I see more and more avocado trees being planted around here on hillsides.
Avocados are still a good crop around here. Lemons, there's a lot of competition from other countries now, so lemons are kind of going out of production. There used to be a lot of oranges, not so much in Moorpark, but in the rest of Ventura County, and most of those are gone now because of the competition.
Well, I have a friend who owns Rancho de las Flores, and it's 40 acres of commercially planted avocado trees, and they're constantly competing with avocados from out of the country. So this area is uh, quite affected by produce and everything that we get from all over the world.
Moorpark's ancient history goes back to the ocean. When you go into the hills around Moorpark and you dig very deep at all, I've never personally done this, but I've heard about it, you find seashells. And so there is a lot of mining today that goes on around Moorpark because you have layers and layers of sand, and that's what's used in making cement and other products. So Moorpark does a lot of mining to the north in the hills between here and Fillmore.
Correct. Good. I think you covered quite a bit. I think that's about it.
Okay.
That's good.
We are now in what is called the Mountain Meadows development in Moorpark, and Mountain Meadows didn't exactly double the population of Moorpark, but it did a great deal to increase the size of the town. It was part of a master plan development that was started in the mid-1980s. It has a couple of schools, a commercial center with a grocery store. It was built in 3 different phases. It's a very nice part of town to live in. Lots of landscaping along the streets so that it's very scenic and pretty. Here we have Mountain Meadows Park and Mountain Meadows School. One thing Moorpark has a lot of is parks. To a great extent, that's because in the 1970s, the state mandated that people who built new housing developments had to dedicate parkland space or donate a big sum of money to the city. And what happened is it's a lot cheaper, apparently, to donate land. The theater on High Street over here was the original theater in Moorpark. It was built in the 1920s and for years was the only movie theater in all of eastern Ventura County. So people from Simi Valley and Thousand Oaks, if they wanted to see a movie, they had to come over here. It's gone through a number of ownership changes, and at times we had candy shops off to the side of it. Right now it's vacant. It was a melodrama theater with live theater for many years, and it's renovated inside. It's absolutely beautiful, and there's a group that's trying to get the city or some other entity to buy it to keep it as a performing arts center. Here at the corner of Moorpark Avenue and High Street, we have Caesar's Carpets. It used to be I.G. Tanner's garage, and it's one of the oldest buildings in Moorpark. It was built around 1905. Basically, it's a brick facade, and then there's a wooden building behind it. And it was the home to the first gas station in Moorpark, although my understanding is at the time there weren't even any cars here in town. As late as 1910, there were only 2 cars in all of Moorpark, and they were both owned by the Cornett family. I.G. Tanner, he had the equipment here for the volunteer fire department, so that if there was a fire anywhere around, he'd be there and he'd bring out the equipment and even pick up firefighters on his way to the fires. In 1928, the St. Francis Dam collapsed out in Valencia, and about 400 people drowned. The bodies were all downstream on the Santa Clarita River from Valencia all the way down to the ocean. And bodies that were picked up on the south side of the river were brought up here to this building and Whitaker's Hardware building, where they were kept until their bodies could be claimed by the families. The pepper trees were planted in about 1900 by Robert Poindexter and the other people in the town to give a little bit of ambiance. Some of them have fallen down over the years because of age, and some of the others are diseased right now. But we're dedicated to making sure that pepper trees stay on High Street because it's so identified with the town. For a while here, they were trying to get everything to look Western. And then people who had been here for a long time said, we weren't a Western town, we were a farm town. This was done in the mid-'80s. The Asadurian family owned this block, and they put the facades on all of these buildings. It had just been a pretty plain building, and they decorated it up and made it the Western style. It's pretty cute. Here we have what a lot of people think is the old depot for the railroad. Actually, the depot was here at one time, but it was torn down. And what was put up here were granaries for one of the egg ranches north of town. But it was pretty ugly having these huge silos in the middle of town, so the owner built a facade to look like the depot. It's kind of falling into disrepair now, but a lot of people will go by it and say, what a great place for a bed and breakfast, or what a wonderful place for a restaurant, when actually all it is like the movies, just a facade. It's just the front of a building. There's nothing else there. And the granary isn't used anymore because the egg ranches no longer exist. So it's owned by the city, and they're looking at different ways to redevelop it or restore it. Here we have what was the Methodist Church in Moorpark. It's been a Baptist church and other things over the years. But it was originally two separate churches. One of them was north of town up in the Fairview district. The other one was in Somas, and they were both built in the 1800s. And then when Moorpark started to grow, the churches were brought here and joined together and became the Methodist Church here in Moorpark, which was about the only church that there was in town until 1920 or so. So if you weren't Methodist, you really didn't have a place to worship back then before we finally got a Catholic church and a Foursquare church and some of the other churches that came to town. If you look there, you can see that they're joined together. You have two different peaks and two sides, and that's reflective of the way the two churches were joined together when they were brought here.
The history?
I don't. I wish I did. I know it's one of the oldest, or the oldest house in Moorpark.
It is. I guess it was put here in 1903.
Oh my God, how cute. And you say put here, was it built or was it
They
moved?
dragged it here.
Oh, they
Oh,
did?
They moved it.
See, I didn't know
Actual
that.
building.
They actually moved it to this corner, to what I've been told, you know, with mules and stuff. And I guess they added on later.
Ah.
I guess there used to be a big barn in the back. I kind of painted both of these are mine. I painted them both and kind of make them kind of look okay.